Chapter 5 Harold, Earl, and King. 1. The Return of Godwine and Harold. When Duke William paid his visit to England in 1052, Godwine and all his family, save only the Lady Edith, were in banishment, and the Normans were in full power in the land. But before long the English were looking to have Godwine back again. Men soon began to tire of the king's foreign favorites, who, it seemed, could not even defend the land against the Welsh. For the Welsh king, Gruffydd, came into Herefordshire, and smote the Normans, who held Richard's castle. Men sent to ask Godwine to come back. He prayed the king to let him come back, and he got Count Baldwin, with whom he was staying, and also the king of the French to ask for him. But the king's favorites would not let him hearken. Then in 1052, Godwine made up his mind to come back without the king's leave, as he knew that no Englishman was likely to fight against him. He therefore set sail from Flanders, and Harold and Leofwine set sail from Dublin. The crews of their ships must have been Irish Danes, which perhaps made Englishmen afraid of them. For when they landed at Porlock, in Somerset, the men of the land withstood them, and Harold and Leofwine beat them in a battle, and harried the neighborhood. But when Godwine came to southern England, no man withstood his coming, but in most parts the folk joined him willingly, saying that they would live and die with him. The king got a fleet against him, but the crews had no heart, and the fleet was scattered before Godwine came. At last Godwine's ships and Harold's met, and they sailed up the Thames together, and came before London on September 14th. The citizens then said that what the Earl would, they would. The king and his earls brought up an army and another fleet, but the men would not fight against Earl Godwine. Then peace was made. It was agreed that an assembly should be held the next day to settle everything. Then Godwine landed, having come back without shedding of blood. Then fear came on all the Normans who were in and near London, and they fled hither and thither. Specially the Norman Archbishop Robert and Ulf Bishop of Dorchester cut their way out of the city, slaying as they went beyond sea, and never came back to England. 2. The Restoration of Godwine. The next day the assembly met and voted that Godwine and all his family should be restored to all their goods and honors. It was voted also that all the Normans who had misled the king, especially Archbishop Robert, who was gone already, should be banished. So Godwine and Harold got back their earldoms, and the Lady Edith came back from her monastery. Only Swegan did not come back, for he had repented him of his sins and gone barefoot on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and had died on the way back, about the time that his father and brothers came home. Of the king's Norman friends, some were allowed to stay, and Bishop William of London was allowed to keep his bishopric. But from this time no more Normans got bishoprics or other great offices. And the English Bishop Stigand got the Archbishopric of Canterbury instead of Robert. This is a thing to be specially remembered, for it was made a charge against Stigand, Godwine, Harold, and the whole English nation, that Robert had been driven from his archbishopric, and Stigand put in his place, without the authority of the Pope, but merely by a vote of the English assembly. The popes therefore never acknowledged Stigand as lawful archbishop, and though he kept the archbishopric till 4 years after William's coming, many people in England seem to have been afraid to have any great ecclesiastical ceremony done by him. Bishops commonly went to be consecrated by the Pope, or else by the Archbishop of York. It is easy to see how Duke William was able to turn all this to his own ends. 3. The death of Godwine. At the Eastertide of the next year, April 15th, 1053, Earl Godwine died. He was seized with a fit while at the king's table, and died 3 days after. The Normans told strange tales about his death, but that is the simple story in our own chronicles. Then his son Harold succeeded him, as Earl of the West Saxons, and was the chief ruler of England during the remaining 13 years of Edward's reign. There is no sign of any dispute between the king and the earl, though Edward's chief favorite was not Harold, but his younger brother Tostig. The king was allowed to have his Norman friends about him in offices of his court, but not to set them over the kingdom. Bishoprics were given either to Englishmen or to men from Lorraine, that is, we should now say, from Belgium, who could most likely speak both Low Dutch and French. The king's nephew Ralph and his friend Otta kept their earldoms as long as they lived, but as earldoms fell vacant, they were given to men of the two great families of Godwine and Leofric. Elfgar, son of Leofric, succeeded Harold in East Anglia. In 1055, Seward of Northumberland died, and his earldom was given to Tostig, the son of Godwine. And when in 1057 the earls Leofric and Ralph died, the earldoms were parted out again. Alfgar took his father's earldom of Mercia. Only Ralph's earldom of Hereford, which needed specially to be guarded against the Welsh, was added to Harold's earldom. Godwine's son Gurth succeeded Alfgar in East Anglia, and his other son, Leofwine, got Kent and the other shires round London. Thus the greater part of England was under the rule of the House of Godwine, and what was not remained under the House of Leofric. And when Elfgar died, his son Edwin succeeded him. 4. The Scottish and Welsh Wars. These later years of Edward's reign, in which Harold was truly the ruler of England, were marked by several stirring events. Thus there was a war with Scotland, where the crown had been more than once disputed between two families. The present King Macbeth had come to the crown after a battle, in which Duncan, the former king, was killed. Duncan was a kinsman of Earl Seward, who therefore wished to restore his son Malcolm. In 1054, Seward entered Scotland, defeated Macbeth, and declared Malcolm king. But the war went on for 4 years longer, till Macbeth and his son were killed, and Malcolm got the whole kingdom. Then there were several wars with the Welsh, under their last great king, Gruffydd, son of Llewellyn. In 1055, Earl Alfgar was banished. He then joined Gruffydd in an invasion of Herefordshire. Earl Ralph went out to meet him, but either he only knew the French way of fighting, or he liked it best. So he made the English go into battle on horseback, to which they were not used, and they were therefore defeated. Elfgar and Gruffydd then burned and sacked Hereford, but Earl Harold came and fortified the city afresh. Peace was made with Gruffydd, and Elfgar got his earldom back again. Gruffydd presently made war again, but he lost part of his lands as the next peace. He seems to have always kept up his connection with Elfgar and his family, and he married Elfgar's daughter, Ealdgyth. At last, in 1062, his ravages could no longer be borne, and it was determined to subdue him altogether. The next year, Earl Harold waged a great campaign in Wales, in which, the better to fight among the mountains, he made the English take to the Welsh way of fighting, and so made all the Welsh submit. Gruffydd was presently killed by his own people, and Earl Harold gave Wales to 2 princes, Bledon and Rhywellon, to hold as the king's men. These Welsh and Scottish wars make up nearly all that happened between England and other lands during this time. There was peace with Normandy, but Duke William paid no more visits to his cousin the king. Of a visit which Earl Harold made to him, we shall speak presently. 5. The succession to the crown. All this time men must have been thinking who should be king whenever King Edward should die. By English law, when the king died, the wise men chose the next king. But they chose from the kingly house, and if the last king left a son of an age to rule, he was almost always chosen. Indeed, if he were actually the son of a king, born after his father was crowned, he had a special right to be chosen. But the crown had never been given to a woman, nor does it seem that the son of a king's daughter had any claim above another man. But it was held that though the crown could not pass by will, yet some weight ought to belong to the wishes of the late king. Now King Edward had no children, and the only man in the kingly house was his nephew Edward, the son of his elder brother Edmund Ironside. This is he who had been sent away as a child in Canute's time. He was now living in Hungary, with his wife and 3 children, Edgar, Margaret, and Christina. King Edward in 1054 sent for him to come to England, doubtless meaning that he should succeed him. This shows that he had quite given up all thought of being succeeded by his Norman cousin, Edward the Atheling, that is, the king's son, as son of Edmund Ironside, came to England in 1057. But he sickened and died soon after he landed. His son Edgar was quite a child, and was not a king's son. Moreover, he was not born in the land, and he could hardly have been much of an Englishman. Men had therefore to think who should be king if King Edward died before Edgar was grown up. One can fancy that the king might have wished to leave the crown to his nephew, Earl Ralph. But though he was the king's nephew, he was not of the kingly house, and he was not an Englishman. Ralph, too, died the same year. We can hardly doubt that from this time men began to think whether a time might not come when they should have to choose a king, not of the kingly house. From this time Earl Harold seems to hold a special place, and to be spoken of in a special way. His name is joined with the king's name in a way which is not usual, and he is even called Sebregulus, or under-king. All this looks as if the thought of choosing him king, whenever Edward should die, was already in men's minds. 6. Earl Harold's church at Waltham. In those days, almost every great man, both in England and in Normandy, thought it his duty to make some great gift to the church, commonly to found or enrich some monastery, to build or rebuild its great church or minster. Many monasteries were founded, and churches built at this time in Normandy by Duke William and his barons, and it was the same in England. King Edward's great business was to rebuild and enrich the minster of St. Peter on the Isle of Thorney, in the Thames, which, as standing west from the great church of London, the church of St. Paul, was known as the Westminster. So the Lady Edith, Earl Leofric, and his wife Godgifu, Earl Seward, Earl Otta, and many bishops and abbots were busy at this time building churches and founding monasteries. Earl Godwine is the only great man of the time of whom we hear nothing of the kind. Earl Harold, on the other hand, was as bountiful as any of them, only his bounty went, not to the monks, but to the secular clergy. These were those clergy who were not, like the monks, bound by special vows in their own persons, but only by the general law of the church. They were the parish priests and the canons of cathedral and collegiate churches. Only in England, several cathedral churches were now served by monks, and more were afterwards. For the monks were much more in fashion just now. Earl Harold, however, when he founded a great church, placed in it not monks, but secular canons. This was at Waltham in Essex. A church had been founded there in Canute's days by his banner-bearer Taufig the Proud, who put in it a rood or cross which had been brought from Leodgarisper, afterwards called Montacute, in Somerset, and which was thought to work wonders. Harold now rebuilt Taufig's church on a greater scale, and whereas Taufig had founded only 2 priests, Harold raised the number to 12, one of whom was dean, and another child-master. Earl Harold had through his whole life a special reverence for the Holy Cross of Waltham, and in battle, the war cry of his immediate following was, "Holy Cross." 7. Harold and William. The Duke of the Normans and the Earl of the West Saxons were thus both of them winning fame and power, each of them on his own side of the sea. They were beyond all doubt the foremost men, the one in England, the other in Gaul. But there was a difference between their positions which arose out of the different political conditions of England and Gaul. Harold was a subject of the King of the English, his chief adviser and minister, the ruler of a great part of the kingdom under the king. But he was still a subject, though a subject who had some hope of being one day chosen king over his land and people. William could not be called a subject of the King of the French. He was a sovereign prince, ruling his own land, and owing at most an external homage to the king. But he had no chance, as Harold had, of ever becoming a king in his own land. His only chance of becoming a king was by winning, either by force or by craft, the crown of England. Harold and William were therefore rivals. By this time they must have known that they were rivals. But as yet nothing had happened to make any open enmity between them. They could hardly have met face to face, but each must have carefully watched the course of the other. And before long, they were to meet face to face. But there are so many stories as to the way in which their meeting came about that it is very hard to say anything at all certain about it. Harold made a journey on the continent in 1058, when he made the pilgrimage to Rome, and it is said that on his way back, he carefully studied the state of things among the princes of Gaul. At that time, William's chief enemies, Henry of France, William of Aquitaine, and Geoffrey of Anjou, were all alive, and it may be that Harold had some schemes of alliance with some of them, in case William should ever put forth any dangerous claims. But of the details of this journey, we know nothing. The Norman writers always said that Harold at some time or other took an oath to William, which he broke by accepting the English crown. But they tell the story in so many ways with so many differences of time, place, and circumstances that we cannot be certain as to any details. The English writers say nothing about the story, but the fact that they do say nothing about it is the best proof that there is some truth in it. For there are many Norman slanders against Harold, which they carefully answer. So we may be sure that if they could have altogether denied this story, if they could have said that Harold never took any oath to William at all, they would gladly have said so. We may therefore believe that Harold did take some kind of oath to William, which oath William was able to say that Harold had broken. But further than this we can say nothing for certain. All that we can do, therefore, is to tell the story in that way which, out of the many ways in which it is told, seems the least likely. 8. The Oath of Harold. It would seem, then, that most likely in the year 1064, after the Welsh War, Harold was sailing in the Channel, most likely with his brother, Wulfnoth, and his sister, Elfgifu. They were wrecked on the coast to Poitou, where Count Guy, according to the cruel custom of the time towards shipwrecked people, shut up Harold in prison, in hopes of getting a ransom. But the Earl contrived to send a message to Guy's lord, Duke William, and the Duke at once sent to release him, paying Guy a large ransom. William then took Harold to his court at Rouen, and kept him there as his guest in all friendship. Harold even consented, in return doubtless for the kindness which the Duke had shown him, to help William in a war, which he was carrying on with the Breton Count Conan, a war in which William and Harold together took the town of Dinan. At some stage of this visit, Harold took the oath. It seems most likely that the oath really was simply to marry one of William's daughters, but that the oath was accompanied by an act of homage to William. Such acts of homage were often done in return for any favor, without much being meant by them. And Harold had just received a great favor from William in his release from Guy's prison. The act might be understood in two ways, but it is plain that William would have a great advantage when he came to claim the crown, from the fact that Harold had in any way become his man. All kinds of other stories, some strange, some quite impossible, are told. Harold is made to promise not only to secure the crown to William on Edward's death, but to give up the castle of Dover and other places in England to be held by Norman garrisons. And there is one specially famous tale how William tricked Harold into swearing quite unwittingly in an unusually solemn way. He was made, so the story ran, to put his hand on a chest, and it was shown to him afterwards that this chest was full of the relics of saints. And those who tell this story are much shocked at the supposed crime of Harold, but seem to see no harm in the trick played by William. The stories all contradict one another, but they all agree in one thing, namely, in making Harold promise to marry a daughter of William. And this promise he certainly did not keep. After all this, Harold went back to England, leaving, as it would seem, his brother, Wulfnoth, as a hostage for fulfillment of his promise, whatever that promise was. 9. The Revolt of Northumberland. It will be remembered that Tostig, the son of Godwine, had been made Earl of the Northumbrians on the death of Seward in 1055. Beside Northumberland, his earldom took in the outlying shires of Northampton and Huntingdon. The Norman tales speak of Harold and Tostig as having been enemies from their boyhood. But there is nothing to make us think that there is any truth in this, and Tostig helped Harold in his Welsh wars. Tostig had also some wars of his own with Malcolm of Scotland, who invaded Northumberland, although he and Tostig were sworn brothers. Tostig also, like Harold, made the pilgrimage to Rome, and when he and his people were robbed, he used some very bold language to Pope Nicholas. In his own earldom, he had a fierce people to rule, and he ruled them fiercely. Beginning with stern justice, he gradually sank into oppression. He seems also to have given offense by staying away from his earldom with the king, with whom he was a great favorite, and handing Northumberland over to the rule of one Copsige. At last, when he had put several of the chief men to death and had laid on a very heavy tax, the whole people revolted. This was in October 1065. They held an assembly at York, in which they declared Tostig deposed, and chose Morkere, the son of Elfgar, to be their earl. Under him, Oswulf, a descendant of the old earls, was to rule in Bernicia. They rifled Tostig's horde. They killed his followers and friends, and marched to Northampton, harrying the land as they went. There Morkere's brother Edwin, the Earl of the Mercians, met them with the men of his earldom and a great body of Welshmen. Thus half England was in revolt. Tostig meanwhile was hunting with the king in Wiltshire. The king was eager to make war on the Northumbrians, but Earl Harold wished to make peace, even at the expense of his brother. The king at last gave him full power to settle matters, so he held an assembly at Oxford, and as he saw that it was hopeless to try to reconcile Tostig and the Northumbrians, he granted their demands. Peace was made, and the laws of Canute were renewed. That is to say, it was decreed that Northumberland should be as well ruled as it had been in Canute's day. Morkere was acknowledged as Earl of the Northumbrians, but Northamptonshire and Huntingdonshire were given to Waltheof, the son of Seward. And Oswulf, one of the blood of the old Northumbrian earls, ruled, seemingly under Morkere, in the northern part of the earldom, that which was now beginning to be specially called Northumberland. Tostig was banished and sought shelter in Flanders. By this revolution, the house of Leofric became again at least as powerful in England as the house of Godwine, setting aside the personal influence of Harold. 10. The death of Edward. We have now come near to the end of King Edward's reign. All this time he had been building the great church of St. Peter at Westminster, close by his palace, and he was just able to finish it before he died. The wise men came together at Westminster for the Christmas feast of 1065. The king wore his crown as usual, but he fell sick before the hallowing of the new minister, which was done on Innocents' Day. Before the feast was over, on January 5th, 1066, he died, the last king of the male line of Cerdic. Before he died, he uttered some strange words which were taken to be a prophecy, and which were in after times understood of the conquest of England and of the succession of the kings who followed. But his last act was to recommend the wise men to choose Earl Harold as king in his stead. The next day, the feast of the Epiphany, King Edward was buried in his own church of St. Peter. He had built it specially to be the crowning place and the burying place of kings. It was put to both uses within a few days after it was hallowed. 11. The election and coronation of Harold. And now the time had come for which men must have been looking so long. King Edward was dead, a new king had to be chosen, and there was no one in the kingly house fit to be chosen. As the Christmas feast was not yet over, the wise men were still gathered together at Westminster, so that they could choose at once. It is not clear whether anybody in England knew anything about Harold's oath to William. If anything was known of it, it must have been held to be of no strength. Nor do we know whether the claims either of William or of Edgar were spoken of or thought of. The thing which is certain is that as soon as Edward was dead, the assembly met, and according to the late king's wishes chose Earl Harold king. The next day he was hallowed to king in the new church of St. Peter. That is, he was crowned and anointed, and he swore the oath to his people. As men had doubts whether Stigand of Canterbury was a lawful archbishop, the right was done by Ildred, Archbishop of York. Of this there is no real doubt, though some of the Norman writers say that Harold was crowned by Stigand. That is, they wish to imply that he was not lawfully crowned. For in those days the crowning of a king was not a mere pageant. It was his actual admission to the kingly office, just like the consecration of a bishop. Till he was crowned, he might have, by birth or election, the sole right to become king. But he did not become king till the oil was poured on his head and the crown set upon it. So men might argue that if the rite was done by an archbishop who had no good right to his see, the coronation would not be valid. All this is worth marking, as shown the feelings of the time. But there is no doubt that Harold came to the crown quite regularly, that he was recommended by Edward on his deathbed, that he was regularly chosen by the assembly, and regularly crowned by Archbishop Eldred. If things had gone on quietly, Harold would most likely have been the first of a new line of kings. This event in our history is very much like what had happened among the Franks 300 years before. The last king of the house of the Merwings was deposed, and Pippin, the father of the Emperor Charles the Great, was chosen king in his stead. Only in England there was no need to depose Edward, but merely to choose Harold when he died. And in one very important point, the change of the kingly house among the English was quite unlike the same change among the Franks. For the Pope specially approved of the election of Pippin, while the Pope was very far from approving of the election of Harold. 12. King Harold in Northumberland. One of the English chronicles says that the 9 months of the reign of Harold were a time of little stillness. So it truly was. He was hard at work from the very beginning. At what time Duke William first sent to challenge the crown is not certainly known, but it is not likely to have been very long after Harold's crowning. Of this, however, we shall best speak in another chapter. But the new king found at once that part of his kingdom was not ready to acknowledge him. This was Northumberland, to the people of which land he had lately shown so much favor, by confirming their deposition of his own brother, and their choice of Morkere as their Earl. Harold had indeed been crowned by their own archbishop, and their chief men must have acknowledged him, along with the rest of the wise men. But we should remember that at an assembly in London, though there would be many men present from Wessex, Mercia, and East Anglia, there could not be many from Northumberland. This would indeed be true of almost every assembly that was held at all, for the 3 usual places were Winchester, Westminster, and Gloucester, all of them places convenient in turn for different parts of southern England, but none of them convenient for Northumberland. But the change of the kingly house was an act of greater weight than any other, and the Northumbrians might have some kind of ground for saying that the choice had been made without their consent. How far the brother earls Edwin and Morkere had anything to do with stirring up discontent, we cannot tell. But their doings, both before and after, look like it. Anyhow, the Northumbrians refused to acknowledge King Harold. The king now did just as he had done a few months before. He did not think of force, but he went himself to York, taking with him his friend Wulfstan, Bishop of Worcester, a most holy man, who was afterwards called Saint Wulfstan. At York he held an assembly, and the speeches of the king and the bishop persuaded the Northumbrians to submit without any fighting. And it was most likely at this time, and by way of further pleasing the Northumbrians, that King Harold married Ealdgyth, the sister of Edwin and Morkere, and widow of the Welsh king Gruffydd. He thus made it quite impossible that he could marry Duke William's daughter. And the Norman writers do not fail to speak against the marriage on that score, and further to blame him for marrying the widow of a man whom he had killed. Yet Harold had simply overcome Gruffydd in fair warfare, and he had nothing to do with his death, which was the deed of Gruffydd's own people. 13. The Comet. King Harold came back from York to Westminster, and there kept his Easter feast. The usual place was Winchester, but London was now growing in importance, and specially so during these few months of Harold's reign, for he was busy the whole time in making ready for the defense of all southern and eastern England, and for this London was the best headquarters. He did not appoint any Earl of the West Saxons, but kept Wessex in his own hands, while the southeastern shires formed the earldoms of his brothers Gurth and Leofwine. We read much of his good government and good laws, which of course simply means that he went on doing as king as he had done as earl. For any making of new laws he had no time, but he seems to have given what heed he could to ecclesiastical appointments and reform, for it was specially needful for him to get the clergy on his side. One thing specially marked this Easter assembly. A most brilliant comet was seen, which is recorded by all manner of writers both in England and elsewhere. In those days, when astronomy was little known, men believed that a comet was sent as a sign that some great event was going to happen. So now men gazed at the hairy star, and wondered what would come of it. By this time, everyone must have known something of the great struggle which was coming. The comet, it was thought, foretold the fall of some great power, but they could not yet tell whether it foretold the fall of Harold or the fall of William. 14. Summary. We have thus seen how after the death of his father, Harold, as Earl of the West Saxons, gradually became chief ruler of England, and how the path was opened to him to become king on Edward's death. We have seen how he made some kind of oath to Duke William, which might be said to be broken by his accepting the crown. We have seen how he was nevertheless regularly named, chosen, and crowned king, and how he got possession of the whole kingdom. We have now to see what was all this while going on beyond sea, what preparations his rival Duke William was making, and what other dangers were threatening England from other quarters.